Hello and welcome to my new apartment. You can't see most of it, you can just see my new bookshelf, but yes, that is the reason that I haven't uploaded anything in 2 months. So I figured instead of trying to do like 2 videos or something that is gonna take forever because I don't have time for that, I'm just gonna do a rapid fire June-July wrap up. I'm not gonna talk too much about each book. I'm really going to try not to talk too much about each book. June, of course, was Pride Month, so you will see a familiar theme of queer horror. I did talk about that in my last video, if you can remember that far back. So yeah, let's talk about everything I've read from June 1st until now. So up first is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, which I read on audio. This was a fantastic time. It's Jurassic Park with mermaids. What more can you want? Really didn't skimp out on the gore, which I was really happy about since it's more shelved in sci-fi. There is definitely horror to be had here. There's great representation, lesbian characters, bisexual characters, neurodivergent lesbian characters, deaf characters, and ASL incorporated in a very creative way. I loved this book. I had a great time with it. I don't think it's, the best thing in the world, and it is perhaps a little long. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a blast. I highly recommend it, even if you're not a horror fan. If you can stomach a little bit of gore, then I think you will really enjoy it too. Like I said, it's Jurassic Park with mermaids. Actually, I'm really glad that I'm talking about some of these books sort of later, having marinated on them, because not that my opinions have changed drastically on any of them, but my ratings on a couple did change, and this is one of them. The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. Now, if you follow me on Goodreads, which probably not because I've never plugged my Goodreads in these videos, but I will do it in this one. I gave this 5 stars when I first read it. I thought it was fantastic. I have since lowered my rating to 4 stars just because it hasn't really stuck with me, and usually things that I keep at 5-star ratings are ones that I'm thinking about for weeks and months afterwards, and this is just not really one of them. But as a thriller horror, it is really intense. It's really page-turning. Didn't take me long to get through it at all. I really liked the gay representation in this. I don't think Paul Tremblay is gay. I'm pretty sure he is married to a woman. This is not a book about bigotry, but I did find some thematic resonance with sort of indirect bigotry. I've heard some people say that it slows down and then it's a little dull, and I did not get that out of it at all. I really was captivated from page 1 to the end. I was worried that it was going to be more of a thriller than a horror, but this definitely doesn't cheap out on some of the violence, and I found it very frightening. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Next, I read one of the more popular extreme horror novels, Womb by Duncan Ralston. So this is a very brief horror novella, but it does tell you at the bottom it is an extreme horror novel. And yeah, it definitely is. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. I was very disgusted by it. I wouldn't say that this disturbed me in any way. There wasn't anything that actually was taboo breaking for me, or that I thought, oh my god, I can't believe you went there. Only insofar as that's a lot of bodily fluids. If that's the kind of thing that you have a weak stomach for, which actually I discovered reading this book that I really do. It is told in sort of a vignette structure, and the way they tie up towards the end is really satisfying. Very sexually explicit and very transgressive. Definitely not the most extreme thing I've ever read, but one of the most disgusting things I've ever read. Next, I decided to check out You've Lost a Lot of Blood by Eric LaRocca. This book in particular just recently skyrocketed in popularity again, I think because of TikTok. I have to say I was a little disappointed with it. I didn't hate it, but I got to the end and just sort of thought, okay, and it hasn't stuck in my memory so much. It's a very strangely structured book. The bulk of it, you were reading a novella that was supposedly written by one of the characters in the in-between segments. So it is kind of a story within a story format, and frankly, the stuff in between the novella was what I really connected with. There's poems and these sort of very disturbing personal confessions. As far as the horror elements go, it was not as strong as I would like. Eric LaRocca does a really great job of creating these very strange landscapes and sort of it's like you're reading something that's set in like a liminal space or one of those like viral backrooms YouTube videos. So there is something sort of existentially unsettling about it. And then of course the titles of his books are fantastic. You've lost a lot of blood. Between each chapter, that phrase is just repeated along with a drawing of a centipede, I think. And so these titles, they just sort of repeat in your mind as you're reading. And I really liked that aspect of it. I'm curious to check out more Eric LaRocca, as you'll see at the end of this video. Something about this just really underwhelmed me. Next, I kind of stepped away from queer horror for a second, because I just was really getting the itch to return to this author. Offspring by Jack Ketchum. This is the sequel to Off Season, which I gave a rave review in one of my other videos. It follows the offspring of the cannibal clan in the first book. I thought it was great. It really is similar to Off Season. I probably would have given this 5 stars too if I hadn't read Off Season first. A lot of the shock and the visceral terror of the first book you're kind of already expecting, so it doesn't hit quite as hard, although it is, I'd say, about equally as extreme. I really loved it. I think Jack Ketchum is fantastic at tension. He's also really great at character. I think what makes him more readable than a lot of other extreme and splatterpunk, or at least to me feel a little bit less pulpy and exploitative, is the empathy he shows for his characters. You're always in the mind of the character that's going through the traumatic thing. You're not looking at it from a third-person perspective. It is the reader that is going through this, and I think that generates so much empathy. I found it just perfectly dancing that line between extreme but not tasteless, or at least not overly tasteless. I mean, all extreme horror is going to be to varying tastes. I wouldn't recommend it if you're sensitive to specifically sexual assault and violence against women. There is a lot of that in all of these splatterpunk books. Now, if you are a fan of the book, it actually was adapted to film. This is a very low-budget film, and it is a little cheesy, a little grungy and grindhousey. I think that just adds to the experience. This is a very faithful adaptation of the book, so if you like the book, definitely check out the movie. They make a very good pairing. Offspring, Jack Ketchum. What do you expect? It's awesome. Now, returning to queer horror, I read one of the novels that I feel the most conflicted on, Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin. This caused quite a splash, made TERFs very, very angry, so of course I had to read it. So this is a story about trans women in an apocalypse that targets people with testosterone in their system, which is a pretty great setup. I will say that as a horror novel, it really did fall short for me. A lot of people have been classifying it as extreme horror, and some of the blurbs on the back, I mean, Brian Keene blurbed this and calls it extreme horror in his blurb. It didn't quite meet that threshold for me. There is a lot of very visceral stuff in here, lots of gore, lots of violence, and yes, lots of rape and tons of sex. Honestly, it's more erotic than it is horror. There's a sex scene per chapter, pretty much, but it does show a great variety of sexual experience, especially because we're following trans characters. And it's not just trans women, there's also trans men, non-binary people, there's sex with cis women as well. Where it really did kind of fall flat for me is that it's a very slow book, surprisingly. Something that sells itself as, you know, this rip-roaring, apocalyptic Mad Max type thing. It's really not that. It is a character study about characters that I really came to care about. They are flawed, but they are incredibly endearing. I think it's a very important book that you should definitely seek out if you have the stomach for it. But I can't say I loved it. It did stick in my mind quite a bit, though, and I'm still thinking about the characters more than anything. It definitely is one of the most emotionally impactful books that I've read, but as a piece of horror, I didn't find it as tense or frightening as a lot of the other stuff that I've read this year. Go into it expecting a character study in a universe that kind of symbolizes what trans existence feels like to trans people right now, at least from what I can gather. Of course, I can't speak for a group that I don't belong to, but it did really ring true to what I know. I will say I don't think it's going to do a great job of swaying people who are not already on board with treating trans people like human beings. I don't think it's going to do a great job of persuading those people, because it is very angry, it is very unforgiving, it is basically a trans manifesto. I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I felt it was very raw, very brutal and emotional. Maybe just not the fast-paced horror novel I was hoping for, but I still think you should read it. Next we have quite a doozy. I read my first Richard Laymon book, which was also Richard Laymon's first Richard Laymon book, The Cellar. I don't know what the hell this is, but I do know that I read it very, very quickly. I couldn't put it down. All the things that people say about Richard Laymon are true, and they are in this book. He writes like a horny, edgy 12-year-old, and, you know, I think that's an extremely valid voice to write from, especially with this pulpy, gross subject matter. I certainly would not recommend this to most people. I think it takes a specific sort of taste and a specific sense of humor to really get something out of it. Otherwise, you're gonna read it and you're gonna think this is terribly written, extremely misogynistic, and makes light of very taboo subject matter. And yeah, it's all of those things, but that's part of the experience, I think. I found it very ridiculous. I enjoyed the hell out of it, and it does make me very happy that I have a pretty decent-sized Laymon collection, because I'm really looking forward to going through more of them. The horror is almost non-existent for most of it. There's just very brief snippets of the beast house in the titular cellar. Most of it does read like sort of cheesy erotica, with some pedophilia sprinkled in for good measure, so definitely content warning there. It's certainly, I won't say it crossed any lines for me, but it came very close in a couple scenes. There's this blurb on the front of pretty much all of Richard Laymon's leisure paperbacks from Dean Koontz, and he says, "No one writes like Laymon, and you're gonna have a good time with anything he writes." I tend to not really believe blurbs, because, you know, why would I? But in this case, I actually think that's completely true. No one writes like Richard Laymon, for better or for worse. This is a truly unique experience that I'm very glad I had. It defies critique. Up next, I read another audiobook, which is a pretty new release, Just Like Mother by Anne Heltzel. I really enjoyed it, actually. I kind of wasn't sure what to think. A lot of the Nightfire releases that I've read have been not so much to my taste. You've heard me talk about Katrina Ward a couple times, and that while I don't think she's a bad writer, I just don't think she's a horror writer. So I kind of go into most of the Nightfire releases with a lot of trepidation. And I was really pleasantly surprised by this one, mostly because of how much I connected to the main character. Not so much in the growing up in a cult kind of way and the stuff about motherhood. I mean, obviously I don't know anything about that, but just sort of her internal world I was able to really relate to, where she's at in life and kind of all of that stuff. I found her an incredibly engaging protagonist, and that really surprised me. I was really happy with how disturbing it was willing to get. A lot of people have compared it to Rosemary's Baby, and yeah, I don't want to get too much into that because I feel like that's edging on spoiler territory, but there are some elements that are similar. That sort of fear of conspiracy. I thought it was a very enjoyable novel. It does kind of fall flat towards the climax. It's a little anticlimactic. I still got enough out of the journey getting there that I really enjoyed it. I'd recommend it. I gave it 4 stars. I then decided to check off a couple things from my long-term TBR. These I've had on my shelf for quite a bit, and just finally got to them. The first was The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. So this has been compared quite a bit to My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. I really don't want them to just kind of fall into the camp of which one is better, although they are very similar in terms of what they're approaching. They're both fictional deconstructions of the slasher genre. I didn't think I was gonna like this very much. It feels a little YA, a little book talk for me, and I actually did enjoy it, but it is one of the least memorable books that I've read this year. I always felt that it was reaching for something that it never quite achieved. It's very clear from the intermittent newspaper clippings and police files, you know, stuff like that, that sometimes or between chapters in books like this. Hendricks has a really interesting philosophy about the slasher genre. There's a lot of interesting stuff between the story, but it doesn't really thematically carry through to the story itself, which I found to be just kind of trite and uninteresting, frankly. It was enjoyable, it kept me reading. It did actually take some turns that surprised me. I wasn't able to predict everything that happened in it. I'm still curious to check out more of Grady Hendrix's work. I really want to read Horror Store. If you like slasher movies, this is worth a read. You'll get a kick out of it, especially the sort of fictional movies that are referenced that were kind of made based on the characters in this book. I think for either legal reasons or artistic ones, he doesn't specifically say, this is Laurie Strode, and the movie based on it is called Halloween. The plot is described, and it's very clear what movie it's supposed to be. It's just an entertaining, pretty quick read. It's a very easy read. I just probably won't ever read it again. And then I read what is now probably my favorite book. I say that without any exaggeration, The Fisherman by John Langan. This has been sitting on my shelf since, I think, January. It was one of the first things I added to my TBR when I started getting into horror. Ocean stuff, water stuff always gets to me in horror. I love it. I really wanted to save this for a special occasion, and I didn't really save it for a special occasion, but I did read it on vacation, which was kind of nice. Yeah, this is something else. This is one of the best books I have ever read. It's beautifully written. There's Hemingway in there. There is Lovecraft, quite a bit of Lovecraft. The weirder it got, the more elements were introduced. Instead of alienating me, it just drew me more in, and it was like, how is this so for me? It's a beautifully written book. It is terrifying. It's very, very emotional. It's very hard to talk about a book that I love this much because I'm just going to gush over every aspect of it. There's kind of a story within a story element that takes up the bulk of the middle section of the book, and I've seen people criticize it for taking you out of the story, but that is the story. That is the meat of the story, and I found it very, very interesting, very dark, very disturbing, and also very beautiful. The way he marries frightening imagery with dreamlike beauty is just unlike any author I've ever read. I can't wait to read more from John Langan. I've got a couple of his short story collections. I really want to beef up my collection and just get all of them. This is just outstanding horror. It deserves to go down as one of the most important horror novels ever. I know it's still relatively new, but clearly this did something for the genre. Fisherman by John Langan. Can't recommend it enough. I fucking love this thing. And oh my god, we've gotten to the end. This was a lot of books that I had to talk about, but the final one is The Black Train by Edward Lee, which was originally published under the title Ghast. Lydia at Typical Books has talked quite a bit about this as one of her favorite Ed Lee novels. It was the first one I read, and I chose to start with this one, both because of how highly Lydia talks about it, and also because it seems to be sort of on the less extreme side of Edward Lee, so I decided to go with this one instead of just jumping into The Big Head or The Haunter of the Threshold. I don't want to start with the most extreme and then go back to something like this and be underwhelmed. And I really loved it. I thought it would be kind of a Richard Laymon type thing, pulpy, not very well written, but I actually found that I think Edward Lee is really smart. And he clearly has a sense of humor. This is very, very funny. Even though it's called The Black Train, at least this printing of it is, it's actually about a haunted house. The train doesn't really have much to do with the story. And the story itself is actually fairly interesting. You almost get two books in one here. You get a ghost story that's set in the present, but really it's more of a romance where there happens to be a ghost story involved. And the main character and the love interest, I really liked them. I thought they were great together. I really liked seeing their courtship unfold. It was honestly really endearing. And then you also get a story that's told through dreams, sort of visions of the past, and also actual testimony of those characters in the past of the construction of this railroad in the South during the Civil War. So, as you might guess, there's stuff about slavery here that's very, very hard to read, and of course, you know, if you're against the idea of a white guy writing about that, avoid this like the plague. I have to say, it didn't cross any lines for me. And like I said about The Fervor, the Almakatsu book, I really like horror that's rooted in real life stuff. And, you know, this definitely doesn't try to sanitize it. It's just really, really nasty evil. I think that's the most you can ask of a book like this, is that it treats it sensitively enough. It's very clear where Edward Lee's heart is in this book. And whether his execution is tasteful to you or not, I think is just down to the individual. Like I said, I really loved it, and the story in the past is a true horror story. If there's one critique I would make, it's that the present timeline just doesn't really have any sort of stakes, and not a whole lot happens, but you get enough of that horror in the past. And like I said, the romance subplot, it's almost like a romantic comedy. There's kind of this knowing element of misogyny, and it does have to do with the house itself kind of impacting the libidos of the people who are in it. The narrator, who's this like Food Network personality who's in search of the best beer in America. His inner monologue is hilarious. There's all this kind of like just very sexual thoughts. Again, it's the house that's kind of causing it. The way he chastises himself for how he's looking at the women is very funny and made for a compelling protagonist. It did read a lot more self-reflective and layered than something like The Cellar. I was really surprised by this book. Edward Lee honestly is a really good writer, like, just period, and it just so happens that he writes in a genre that I'm really drawn to. So I loved The Black Train. I'm really excited to read some more Ed Lee. Be informed. That's all I can say about all of these extreme horror books, is that if you're interested in it, please just look up content warnings, look up, you know, what you're getting yourself into, so that you don't end up putting yourself through something that is too much for you. Just because I like this stuff and I have a stomach for it doesn't mean that I'm going to recommend it to everyone. Doesn't mean that it isn't too far for some people. It's just not too far for me, and I honestly don't know if too far exists for me. So I don't really have a TBR for August, since we're already quite a bit of the way through August, and the last couple weeks have just been me hectically moving stuff to my new apartment, and still there's quite a bit to be done here. But I did want to just kind of briefly go through what I'm reading right now. So I'm about a third of the way through The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. I'm enjoying it very much. It's a very slow gothic story, and I like the main character. There's a hot priest, so sign me up. And like I said, I am checking out some more Eric LaRocca with their newest release, We Can Never Leave This Place, which is a very brief novella. It's actually under 100 pages, I think. Again, with the beautiful cover, the beautiful title. So far, I'm intrigued, but as you can see, I'm not very far into it, so I can't really make up my mind yet, but I'm really hoping I like this more than You've Lost a Lot of Blood. And one that I started last night, I decided to just pick something up off my shelf that is an author I've never read before, and that I'm trying to get through this stuff. So I went with House of Pain by Sephora Hiron. I'm not very far in, but it's a leisure paperback. At the very least, I think I'm gonna get something fun. Whew, that was a lot of books. It's been an exhausting week. I'm gonna go lay down. Thanks for dropping in.